1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1 says, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon, whose business was in Carmel. The man was, how rich was he? He was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal. Means fool, by the way. Happy Mother's Day. This guy's mom named him Fool. and there's too many jokes to stop. Let's keep going. And the name of his wife, Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, so David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son, David." When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" Throughout Scripture, we find the word peace. And there is a deeper meaning to the word peace in Hebrew, shalom, than just an absence of war, an absence of conflict. I was reading a piece by a professor and pastor by the name of Tim Mackey this week, and he was talking about peace, and he highlighted this part in Joshua where a wall, as in a wall made out of stones, is described as having shalom. It's deeper than just an absence of conflict. In fact, you might summarize it like this. Shalom, or biblical peace, is the complete, peaceful alignment under God's purpose. And when we started 1 Samuel, we actually came to the people of Israel, and they had an absence of peace, an absence of shalom, an absence of complete, peaceful alignment under God's purposes. They had a high priest whose sons were disobedient. They had a people who, when they saw the disobedience of the high priest's sons, said, maybe God shouldn't be our king anymore. Maybe we should have a king that we can see and touch, who can rule like the other kings around us. And God said, I don't think that's actually what you want. And they insisted, and he said, fine. Enter Saul. His motives, his purposes, his means, his methods, not only out of alignment with each other, but out of alignment with God's purposes. And God promises in 1 Samuel chapter 15 that he is going to raise up a neighbor of Saul who is better than him. And then we see the anointing of David, the upcoming king of Israel. And God has been using Saul to make sure David doesn't become like Saul. God has actually been using Saul to press on David and align his motives, his desires, his means, his methods into complete peaceful alignment with God's purposes. In fact, later, David will go on to be described as a man after God's own heart. David has been shaped by Saul's pursuit, intimidation, and threat. But at the end of our last text, I don't know if you guys remember this, David and Saul appeared to at least work things out for a little while. There's an absence of conflict there. But we'll discover there's still not shalom. Because while God isn't going to use Saul to shape David in this passage, God's still not done shaping David. This time he's going to use a fool named Nabal. I know we've already read it, but let's look back here for just a moment at verse 2. There was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. That's a lot. And he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. We're going to find out here in just a moment when it says he was shearing his sheep. It'll mean the same as the newlyweds in our church right now who are building a house. Haven't swung a single hammer. They're not building the house. They're having the house built. Nabal's not shearing a sheep. Not a single one. He's having them sheared. He's got people to do that for him because he's rich. And he's not just rich. He's what? Very rich. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, specifically not an invasion force. 10 young men. And said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have." Shalom. 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 He's wishing here not just for Nabal's lack of conflict, but for his complete peaceful alignment of him and everything that he has under God's purposes. And he's coming, all these young men are coming in David's name. Now, David was famous by this point. Super famous. He had a hit song written about him. And the song went, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. He's a great warrior. He's famous. Even in our last text, Saul himself has acknowledged, "You shall be king." We're going to discover later in our passage that word had come to Nabal's household of who David was. And David, I think it's part of the reason David tells his young men to greet Nabal in his name. He's got a reputation, and the reputation is that God is fulfilling his purposes through David. God is bringing the people of Israel back to a state of alignment under David. Peace, 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 peace. Verse 7, I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. And they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. So David has run in. This is probably how David knew that Nabal's guys were shearing sheep, was that he had encountered Nabal's shepherds out in the field. And they were good to his shepherds, David and his men. Verse 8, David's like, don't take my word for it. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Excuse me. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, whose reputation almost certainly preceded him. And then they were welcomed in, clothed and fed. No. And then they waited. It's already not a good sign. Any of you ever been to a doctor's appointment where you know you're the first one on the roster for the day? There's no way they're running behind because you were there when they unlocked the door. And you go in and wait. This is not good. How much more so for these men who are hungry, in need, on the run still? Making them wait. It's already bad news. It gets worse in verse 10. And Nabal answered David's servants. Who's David? Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Now you got to understand that up until this point, and we've seen this over and over and over again, Saul has actually been sowing this story among the people close to him, that David is treacherous. He's a traitor. In fact, David confronted him on saying it last week. This almost sounds like maybe Nabal, I don't know for sure, the text doesn't say, possibly, everybody say possibly. Possibly Nabal has actually gotten a hold of some of this propaganda from Saul. And he doesn't like straight up accuse David of breaking away from Saul. But he says, there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Let's count how many times he says my, starting in verse 11. Shall I take my bread? There's one. My water? There's two. My meat? There's three. That I have killed? Okay, that's not a my, but you know what I mean. That I have killed? By the way, did he kill it? No. For my shearers, and give it to men who come from I do not know where. I think before I help you, I'm going to have to see some receipts about where you're coming from on this, David. Now remember, is the Lord with David? Is the Lord with David? Yes, that's actually Saul's biggest problem with David, is that God is with him, that God is working through him. Saul can't stand, in our previous text, that the Lord is with David. Is God working through David? Is God working through David? He is. So you got to understand that when Nabal shuts down the Lord's anointed, David, who, I don't want to preach too early, but there's going to be a son of David who is the Lord's ultimate anointed. His name's Jesus. We'll get to him in a little while. But when Nabal stands against David, he's also standing against God's purposes through David. So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. Here's the testing point. Is David going to react to the way Saul reacts? Which, by the way, would be lock and load, let's roll. Or are David's means going to be aligned with God's purposes? Verse 13, and David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. Not sending 10 young men this time. Lock and load. Let's roll. That's what David does. That's what he says. You got to remember that in our text last week, he was huddled back in the cave. You remember he was in the cave, and then Saul was in the cave too for reasons I won't describe again. And David's in the cave. He's hiding in the cave with his guys, and he has to persuade his men that he's doing the right thing by not killing Saul. So I got to think his guys were probably like, yes, strap on the sword. Let's go. I've been waiting for you to do this. Let's roll. Who is it? What's his name? I don't even know his name. Doesn't matter. Let's go. They're eager. Verse 14. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we went with them. Do you remember when David first made his request, hey, can we get some food? I know it's a feast day. Can you help provide for us? We've got this thing going on where we are trying to fulfill God's purposes, and can you help us out? And one of the things he said was, don't ask your guys. We were with them, and we took care of them. And did you notice that Nabal never did that? Nabal didn't go and ask his guys about it. Abigail's hearing the story from Nabal's guys. Verse 16. They, David's men, were a wall to us both by day and by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master. That's Nabal. And against all his house. And he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. It's only the second time in the book that somebody's gotten described as worthless. I just gotta say this one more time. Can you imagine being called worthless in the Bible? What makes him worthless isn't that he makes the wrong decision. It's not that he's siding with the wrong side. It's that no one can say anything to him. What makes him worthless isn't the decisions he makes. It's that no one can speak to him in a way that has an effect on his mind or his heart. Verse 18. Then Abigail made haste, took 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared. Already prepared probably means she's like taking from the inventory for feast day. 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. Now, lots of numbers there. I was actually, Way and I were chit-chatting about the passage this week, and one of the things he brought up is for the number of guys that has to feed, that's not very much. It's not much. It's not going to make ends meet for 600 hungry guys. It's just not. But I think even more interesting than the contrast to what it could accomplish is where it's coming from. Out of, how many sheep did Nabal have? Anybody remember? 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. How many sheep are going to David and his guys? 5. But I do think this is what she could literally get away with. It's what she could get away with. And she said to her young men, verse 19, "Go on before me, behold, I come after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. Well, why wouldn't she tell him? Because he's such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. Verse 20, "And as she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, 'Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good.'" Verse 22, "God do so to the enemies of David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." Why does our author put that commentary from David right there? Because you need to know that as Abigail squares up to the front line with David, that's what's in his heart. Verse 23, "When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground." Verse 24, "She fell at his feet and said, 'On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt.'" We talked a few weeks ago about the difference between accepting fault and accepting responsibility. This is not her fault, but she's taking on responsibility. It's also worth noting that last time we saw somebody fall down on their knees before someone, it was actually David falling on his knees before Saul. There's a humility here. "Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant." And the fact that she's still talking in verse 25 means that David is not Nabal. She's like, "Will you listen to me?" And then she keeps going. Unlike Nabal, you can't say anything to. Verse 25, let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Verse 26, now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt, and from saving with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. Verse 27, and now let this present that your servant, she's talking about herself there, she's calling herself his servant, has brought to my Lord, that's lowercase Lord, because she's talking to David as her master, be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please, verse 28, please forgive the trespass of your servant. For the Lord will certainly make, the Lord, that's Yahweh, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord, that's David, a sure house. Because my Lord, that's David, is fighting the battles of the Lord, Yahweh. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. She's demonstrating here that David's reputation was, in fact, preceding him to Nabal's household. She knows what's up. She knows what's going on, and somehow she can see what God is doing in and through David. And she is picking sides, and it's not the side her husband picked. Verse 29, if men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord David shall be bound in the bundle of the living, in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. I don't know if she knew exactly how David killed Goliath, but good word choice. Verse 30, and when the Lord has done to my Lord, when the Lord Yahweh has done to my Lord David according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince or leader over Israel, my Lord David shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord, Yahweh, has dealt well with my Lord David, then remember your servant. She comes humbly, but there's a side of a rebuke and an exhortation. She says in there, don't take your salvation into your own hands. Hasn't God been faithful with you? Won't God be faithful to you? Don't take this into your own hands. Certainly not on account of this fool. And kill all of these people needlessly because of this one fool. Keep your hands from blood guiltiness, David. Don't take salvation into your own hands. And then when God does what he's going to do with you, will you remember me, please? She's picking sides. Verse 32. What's David going to say? He's kind of been running the Saul play so far in response to this. Saul would probably say, "Off with your head." Verse 32, David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me." That right there is huge. It's David acknowledging that even in her coming to him, her coming forward to him, it's God working. It's God who sent this, how was she described? Discerning and beautiful woman before me to meet me. Verse 33, blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. He lets her know what was at stake. He's like, if God hadn't sent you to intercept me here right now, everyone would be dead. That's where I was headed toward. And he says, he admits here, it would have lent to his own blood guiltiness. It would not have been counted just and right before the Lord. Verse 35, then David received from her hand what she had brought him. And he said to her, go up in what? Peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. So what does that mean? Does that mean it's not God's will for Nabal to die? Does it mean that God isn't really with David? That one who speaks against David is not, in fact, speaking against the Lord? He's been stopped from this path of taking this guy out. Let's see what happens. Verse 36. How many of you think Nabal still had his feast? You think he still had the feast even without David? Oh, yeah. Verse 36. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house. Like, what kind of feast? What level are we talking about? Like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was not very rich, very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. Some kind of shock. Verse 38. And about 10 days later, who? The Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Hold on. Didn't God send Abigail to stop David from killing Nabal? What's going on? Verse 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. What wrongdoing? God still ended up killing Nabal. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. He draws her further into his life. This woman of beauty, this woman of discernment. One of the things that we talked about at the beginning of our series is that when we're walking through an Old Testament narrative, that it is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. It's not telling us what we ought to do, it's telling us what happened. This passage doesn't mean we should have multiple wives. That's not what this means. That's just what happened here. Verse 40, when the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife. Verse 41, she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of your servants for my Lord. More humility from her, under the purpose that God is fulfilling through David. And Abigail hurried and rose, mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. And then maybe there are some readers who are like, what about Michal, Saul's daughter? Verse 44, editorial note. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Gallim. Somewhere in the midst of earlier conflict, it didn't get recorded that Michal and David weren't together anymore, and that was Saul's doing. What are we to make of this passage? We see David, God's trying to make him a man of peace, a man of shalom, a man who is completely, peacefully aligned under God's purpose, so that he can lead the nation of Israel to be a people who are completely, peacefully aligned under God's purpose. And then we see him get dissed, and we see him take up a sword to handle it, and God sends someone to say, not like that. And then God ends up taking the guy out. So what are we to make of this? All of this leads me to one big takeaway. And it seems to me that it's this. When we're coming to the right conclusion, but in the wrong way, God is gracious to interrupt. When we are coming to the right conclusion in the wrong way, God is gracious to interrupt. David actually came to the right conclusion. If God's purposes were going to be fulfilled in Israel, Nabal had to go. That's the right conclusion. But he was coming to that conclusion the wrong way. He was working out salvation for himself, instead of trusting that God was going to keep working salvation just like he has every step of the way. And there are some of you in here this morning that when you get dissed, even if it's a diss not only against you, but against God's purposes in and through you, your response is lock and load, let's roll. instead of trusting what we talked about last week, that God judges perfectly. I don't need to judge perfectly. God judges perfectly. I wonder how many of us take matters into our own hands and we ignore when God sends us a warning. A warning that though we may be coming to the right conclusion, we're coming to it in the wrong way. That when we're coming to God's conclusions our way, the ends do not justify the means. I remember hearing a pastor say years ago, if you're wrong in the way that you're right, you're wrong even if you're right. Can I tell you? Can we have an in-house discussion real quick? Christians, can I tell you that typically election years are really bad years for Christians to be wrong in the way that we're right? You might be right about God's purposes for our country. You might be right about God's purposes through you. But is your heart ready for a gracious interruption from the Lord? Are you humble enough to receive a gracious interruption from the Lord when you are coming to the right conclusion, but in the wrong way? Some of us are going to see more family members this summer. Vacations, people coming visiting, us going other places and visiting. It's kind of the time of year for that a little bit. And you might be right about what needs to happen in the life of that family member. You might be right about God's purposes in you and through you to minister to them. Are you humble enough to receive an interruption from the Lord when you're coming to the right conclusion in the wrong way? I'll take your silence to mean you need to work on it. And I just want to call you to something higher than that. Let God work on it. Would you just stop resisting him? Would you just stop stiff-arming him? Would you just let him speak right to you in the midst of that conflict? Would you let him remind you the way Abigail reminds David of how he has been so faithful to you so far and of the plans that he has for you from here on? Let me remind you of just one. It's called the gospel. The gospel is the good news that while we were still sinners, Jesus was born, he died on the cross, he rose from the dead, he went to heaven, and he is coming back again. That's my version of Abigail to you. God has some incredible things that he has done for you and still has to do for you, in you, through you. In the name of his Son, Jesus Christ. Things that have an end that will bring to completion this search for shalom. Peace under the purpose of God.